But yes, thank you for sharing your info with us. We'll definitely make sure we take that down. We're going to be having a lot of conversations in November and December, specifically around like food and Kepra's food work, the food work of organizations that we are, close to. So it sounds like you'll definitely be interested in that. But
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate you letting me in your space, and I look forward to collaborating with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But Jeru and Mama Pambana, thank you for joining us. Our check-in question for the day was, what is your favorite piece of art in your home that you have in your home? Your favorite piece of art that you have in your home?
Okay, I'll check in. I am Sunlight White 777, and Stan. His name was Winford Cork, and he was Miss Taylor's partner, and he was an artist, and he drew this picture of a Maasai warrior, and it's about, I want to say, maybe 5 feet in height and maybe 3 to 4 feet in width, but it's just really beautiful. And I have it upstairs on my landing. So that's one of my favorite pieces of art.
So yeah, I'll check in too. Hey everybody. Can y'all hear me? I'm on my phone. So okay, cool. So today I'm feeling like a pink. I'm gonna go 9.5 right now, feeling good. And my favorite piece of artwork in my home is actually a black canvas painting that my grandfather on my mother's side did. And I've had it in my life for probably the last, like, going on like 15 years now. And it's just always been hanging up in my room at some point or another. So I've just really connected with it. I was born in the year of the Tiger, 1998. Let's go. So it's just always been a very powerful symbol to me. And to have just kind of like stumbled upon it in my closet one day was really cool. So that would probably be my favorite. And I'll pass it back inside.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you guys for joining us. So now that we are all checked in, now that we hopefully have our technical issues sorted out, I'm gonna pass it to Damon to introduce himself and to facilitate this conversation around cooperatives, basically. All you, Damon.
Thanks, Jen. Can you give me permission to share and any considerations I need to take if in the case I show this video that's 15 minutes? Do I need to do anything so that audio can be heard?
I think just like when you share, there's like a little checkbox that says like share audio. So just make sure you hit that, but I think that should be fine. You should have sharing permissions now.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Can people see my screen?
We got it.
All right, thanks. Just one quick. I cannot see anybody's face, and I hate that when I share.
They all smiling for you, Damon. Don't worry.
Thank you, Jeru. All right, I can see everybody's face. So yeah, this is the third part, and thank you, Chen, for sharing that. Thanks, Adam and Miss Victoria, for joining us. This is the third installment in an ongoing conversation, dare I say, a learning conversation around cooperatives and cooperative ecosystems, utilizing some examples of things that have worked in the past, also leveraging what we've learned from an earlier book discussion that we had a couple of years back with Dr. Jessica Nimhart on collective courage and how cooperatives or Commonwealth have helped sustain the Black experience and other experiences in America and abroad historically. In that conversation, I'll make sure I drop a link to this PowerPoint in the chat for those that want to come back and reference it. But essentially, just putting notes, thoughts in this document. Once I find chat, I found it. Leave it. Towards ways in which cooperatives are cultivated, how they're seeded, nurtured, and ultimately how they grow long term. And so when we talked about seeding, cultivating in the past, is how we're building ecosystems, movements, community support, social capital around cooperatives. We had around cooperative development. And then the second conversation was related to how are cooperatives and cooperative ecosystems or federations seeded, funded, and now just a conversation today around, of course, you have to see the cooperative, but once it's up and running, how are cooperatives nurtured? How are they funded? How are they built for growth, operations organized, et cetera, et cetera. And there were just some interesting kind of high level topics and ways that happened. And so with the premise and question of being, once for today's conversation, sort of the premise and the theme is once cooperatives and cooperative ecosystems are established and operating, what are some of the practices and principles used to stay in business, not just start the business, but also stay in business. And before we jump into that conversation, I just thought it good to pay homage to a lot of the places where this information is coming from. These are resources that weren't known about, or at least, well, one of them wasn't known about before these conversations. And I just wanted to highlight like where I've been doing a lot of my deep dives, along with Chat GPT. I didn't put that on here, but so some other platforms that people may or may not know about. So Democracy at Work Institute, the United States Federation of Worker Cooperatives, and SELC, which is Sustainable Economies Law Center. And so again, just having those links in there for anybody who wants to know anything about cooperatives. They go really broad and really deep on the subject. But again, coming back to the question, once cooperatives and cooperative ecosystems are established and operating, what are some of the practices and principles used to stay in business? And again, and I guess in my facilitation of these mumbo jumbos, I've been utilizing the Cleveland model of worker cooperatives and Evergreen Fund as a shining example, if you will, or at least from my research, one in where they closely resemble kind of the structure of KEPRA. And I see that people are frozen, so I'm not sure if I'm frozen as well. Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We got it.
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Great. And so again, with the Cleveland model around building cooperative ecosystems, they talk about having anchor institutions be a large part of their sustainability. Then of course, working with government, surrounding community, and nonprofit corporations. And then also one of the main points, one of the main benefits, or one of the main strengths of cooperatives is cooperation within cooperatives. So cooperatives work with, trade with, exchange or discounts, services amongst themselves to keep the Commonwealth amongst the commoners and the workers, and also just to reinforce and help support cooperatives overall. But again, just doing some research and looking at, what are some of the ways that cooperatives stay in business and continue to thrive and grow. There are a number of kind of high level things that we've talked about, seen. But one of the things that I know is super critical and I want to spend some time on a little bit, because it is a personal roadblock, is just how patronage is handled within a cooperative. Because when we talk about sustaining any business, whether it be a cooperative or traditional for-profit business, where funds go, how funds are used, and allocation of funds, profits, surplus is critical to the sustainability of that organization. So you may spend a little bit more time there, but what I'll do is kind of run through some of these points and then spend a little bit of time around, for me, this conversation of patronage and, what are some examples of how patronage works within a cooperative. So one thing that, both in the seed funding stage and in the actual existing funding stage, you have to be very careful when raising capital and promising their return on investment. This is not in every state, but cooperatives have tax benefits and things of that nature, because for profits, it's about, I invest and I get a return on my profit, and the highest priority is the stakeholders. So profit and growth are central when it comes to money. For cooperatives, the ethos is that revenue is a resource for the common good of the workers within the cooperative. And so this idea of securities law, return on investment looks a little bit, in some cases it can be same, but it can look a lot different between organizations. But one thing you have to be careful of, and this is something that even in our space with the Kepler Integrated Fund, this idea of raising capital and promising a return on investment. So one of the things I want to kind of heed in this conversation, and if anything you take away from it, you have to be really critical and careful. Dare I say, talk to legal and accounting before raising funds and or continuing to raise funds towards a cooperative, because it's not necessarily first money in, first money out for a cooperative. There's more democratic power structures, one member, one vote, A stock, B stock, things of that nature that kind of plays into that. So I just put that in purple so that it kind of has some sway on the conversations and how we talk about these things. For today, I'm also kind of keying in on the idea of worker cooperatives, just because they had a number of examples of that. You have Mondragon, as well as the Cleveland model, and other models as well, that are really weighing the balance on time, tools, and talents of the people within the cooperative as an asset versus, say, a community land trust, where land and those other things are the assets of the overall co-op. Not to say that those things can't be owned by worker-owned cooperatives, but I think for the purpose of the conversation, worker-owned cooperatives makes a lot more sense. And so I'll stop there. Said a lot. Not sure if people have questions around that. Cool.
Yes. Could you speak more like, what are some things in your experience that, like, because you said you want to go to accounting and your legal team before even considering trying to start raising capital to try to like get a cooperative model up and running. So, what are some of the things that people could be looking for or at in their environment to say like, oh, this is something that we should go for? Or like, are there any like prerequisites that people need to meet in their environment in order to get a cooperative up and running?
Are there any? Well, so I think I understand the question. In order to set up, build your own cooperative, or even to operate cooperatively, and there's even a trend now where, and we talked about this earlier in Kepra, we aren't per se cooperative structure or, schedule T or anything like that. We're a nonprofit, but we operate cooperatively. So you can set up an LLC and then your operating agreement, put cooperative governance guidelines, bylaws in the org. It's when you go to raise funds. And I do believe there's certain benchmarks for it that I'm not 100% sure. I wish Nicholas was here because he knows all that. But when raising funds, you can't promise a return on investment publicly. Now, privately, you can talk when you're bringing in people and things of that nature. And that lends itself to friends, family, angels, investors, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we talk about a security, it's I pay this and I get a return on that security, regardless of my work and my involvement in the organization if I do anything. And so it's almost a guarantee on your investment, which you can't necessarily offer that out the gate through a cooperative or in any kind of thing when you're raising funds without going through securities. Now, all the legality of why you have to need to do that, I don't know. Maybe Pambana can shed some light on that.
And I think really, J. Rue, I think what I hear Damon trying to say is when you start raising money and making promises, talk to legal to stay out of jail. Do a little research on Marcus Garvey. That's how he ended up getting arrested because he was accused of fraud and then arrested. And then when he got out of jail, shipped off to England somewhere. So I think what he's saying, hey, look, these concepts are great concepts, but when you start soliciting people's money for investment, get some good legal counsel. Then on the accounting side, I think what I hear Damon saying is different infrastructures lead to different kind of financial benefits. And so that's the place where having folks who are steeped in some of those other processes are helpful. So in other words, he's not going to ask for any money today because he's not trying to go to jail today.
My man, J. Rue.
I'll just share that. Damon is talking about investments, and investments is different from membership. So, and I think he got up here, I'm trying to look and see, member patronage, I'm not sure if that's savings, but a lot of times when people start cooperatives, they just have memberships where either a member has to put in a certain amount of dollars to become a member, or they can have do some sweat equity and some dollars, that kind of thing. But this thing about investments, and then I think, I don't know what the Cleveland model is. You can have investors who invest in the co-op, but they're not members. And so, and again, when you start promising that, okay, if you give me X number of dollars for a certain period of time and I'm gonna pay you this interest rate, then you have to register with the Indiana Securities Exchange Commission because that's considered a securities. So that's the only time. And then you need a lawyer involved in that to help you put it together. It's called an offering memorandum in the context of what you're going to provide, what kind of return they're going to get on it, and those kinds of things. But that's only if you accept investments. And I know some co-ops, well, I guess the Cleveland model does, but there are co-ops that don't do investments. And also, Nicholas said he'll try to jump in at the end. He's picking up his girl, so during this time.
For sure, thank you. And thanks for that clarity and Pambana on that. Are there any follow-up questions, J. Rue, or does that answer the question? Does it lead to another?
Yeah, I was gonna say thanks. I think maybe I wasn't looking at it in terms of outside entities or broader corporations or funders or whatever making an investment. So I definitely hear what y'all are saying in terms of, don't make promises you can't keep, not good practice.
Yeah,
I'm
if
hearing
you
that stuff.
want to go and check now, he'd have to come by
So
here.
yeah, it's all back to you, Damon.
Okay. Thanks. And so,
You don't
No,
want to.
Well, I
And I'll-
didn't want to come in from Avon to come by here to get the feedback.
and I'll go to kind of the second one in there because it came up. Now, you can raise funds for your startup or your cooperative startup through a number of ways. Friends, family, angel investors, close knit, up to a certain amount and up to a certain number. And there's different rules. There's more than 100. You have to restructure your corporation and things of that nature. But you can raise from close families and friends, whether that's $1 or things on that. You just still, again, have to be careful about promising a specific return on investment. In a lot of cases, those early investors, angel investors, can invest for a certain amount of equity or ownership in the organization, but you're still staying away from promising them a return on investment based on the dollar amount that they may, or that they may put in the organization. So I wanted to go through that and talk about that as well in terms of how you raise those funds. And again, just to step back a little bit, we're talking about, hey, Cooperative's up, is running. We've got some business. We're turning revenue. We have, maybe 6 or 7 or 8 people in the cooperative. How do we continue to grow and build out and sustain that? And again, one of those main ways are sales, which is pretty straightforward, particularly for worker cooperatives. If you're making something, you want to be able to sell it in return. You want to be able to sell it on a margin, and a margin that's big enough for you to have some surplus in the organization and operational capital throughout it all.
Damon, what does the Cleveland cooperative sell?
So the Cleveland Cooperative has a number of things. I believe the first one that they started with was a dry cleaning business. And the way they started that was they had anchor institutions. So I forgot the name of the hospital, but a large public hospital in the city of Cleveland made a large strategic investment, dare I say 5 to 10 year investment, not just from a financial standpoint, which they did that as well. They invested in the cooperative. They also became partners and board members of the cooperative as well, which is another way to get around raising capital from outside partners. They do have to be involved in the work in some aspects. In that way, it lessens it over security and makes it more of a equity investment in the organization. But then also that hospital served as an investor, served as a board member, and also served as their biggest first client, and I believe still their largest client. One of their other cooperatives that I believe they just turned over was a lettuce internal farm, urban farm. They were selling that wholesale, but transferred that over. And for some reason, the third cooperative that they have, I cannot recall whatsoever. I believe it's an energy cooperative. But within the Evergreen Fund, it's a long evergreen fund that raises dollars to support different cooperative businesses as a federation. So that's how they've been structured. And so taking that back to sales, it's a lot more. What I liked about it is that the hospital, as their largest customer, is a little bit more invested in the organization from a board member standpoint and from an investor standpoint to see it work. And so they have a little bit more patience with it. And in one of the articles that was read, over time, they strategically switched from how much they invest becoming lower to the business that they do with the actual dry cleaning cooperative. And so that gives, that'd be a great thing to have in any business. Hey, I'm gonna be a client for the next 10 years until you get stable footing. I'm also gonna be an upfront investor and partner in it. And so I do behoove us And we have been doing that, right? And other similar models at work have done that, not only just living off of sales of the actual business itself, but having larger institutional partners that are invested in the long run, because they do understand that that further improves and further builds upon the local community in which that business, investor, client works, keeps dollars in the community, which is one of the ultimate goals of working cooperatively. Was that a good job, Havana?
Mhm. That sounds great. Thanks. I just wanted people to have a sense of what kinds of things you could sell. I mean, and again, it doesn't have to necessarily be what I want to say, a material product like laundry. It could be if you can do accounting, or if you can do consulting. So cooperatives can have a number of different products, some of them material, some of them service-based that you sell. But I do agree with Damon that in launching the Evergreen one, having I think it's Cleveland Hospital as a major customer, or at least decide that a portion of their laundry services they would use to help start this cooperative was a big boost.
Another one that I found extremely interesting, and I'm very much at the tip of understanding how that works, but it's come up, we've talked about it several times, is crowdfunding. And so being in the position to make ownership in a larger cooperative or a cooperative federation accessible to those who are not accredited investors. So being able to raise, $5, $10 from those that can have a stake in it. Now you can serve that up from a crowdfunding standpoint. Again, not selling securities, but to Pavana's point, selling membership in a cooperative, which ultimately your membership in that cooperative and includes ownership in the overall corporation, in the overall company as well, which ultimately down the road, your $5 could become a $10 worth of equity in the company, and that equity continues to grow. So crowdfunding is one way. And additionally, you'll see platforms like Kiva, where as opposed to saying, hey, we need investment, we say, hey, we want to build this particular thing. Once we raise, or once we've crowdfunded, let's say 10 grand, that ultimately provides you a number of things. You can say, hey, that'll provide you a membership stake in the cooperative. It can also provide you, one of 100. So this 10K will help us produce our first 100 bikes, for example, let's say. And then that way you're offering a return on the dollar, but you're still raising funds. It's also a great way to pre-sale as well. So you'll see a lot of cooperatives that use crowdfunding and pre-sales in order to raise revenue. And then one of the things I like there, you're getting paid up front, and it's also validating what you're deciding to bring to the marketplace and will it sell. So crowdfunding and pre-sales are, I think, a great way to continue to grow. There was one example, and I'm terrible with names, but there was one example of, I believe, a California-based bakery. They were a co-op. They had their first bakery. They did exceedingly well over the first 3 years with sales, but they wanted to grow and expand. And as opposed to going out taking lines of credit or raising other investments, they raised the crowdfunding. Hey, when we crowdfund, we're going to open up this other location on the other side of town, and your crowdfunding donation, or your crowdfunding contribution will go towards a membership to that coffee shop, or discounts, or access to our workshops in the coffee shop, and things of that nature. So those are all great ways to, once you create the cooperative and is up and running, when you look at ways to grow and expand, it doesn't mean you got to take on debt in a lot of cases. So those are some examples there. Another way that a lot of people aren't aware of is a for-profit company can take donations. It's just the person that gave the donation doesn't get to write that off on their tax because it's not a nonprofit. So again, raising donations is another way that you can continue to build capital, build reserves, and stay sustainable as a cooperative. And in the same way, utilize that towards expanding in the same way that crowdfunding and pre-sales do. And you shouldn't get slapped on the hand. Another great way there is, and we talked about that earlier, is member patronage. Most cooperatives stress some type of upfront capital investment from those that are candidates or those that are members in the initial cooperative. And that can range anywhere from 10 G's to $10 based on how you want to grow and the principles of your cooperative. And so member patronage gets treated as, hey, we were trying to bring 100 members on. In order for us to get started in this cooperative, you have to pay $100 upfront. And or you can pay that $100 over a course of time. And then there's other things and other ways within the organization where that $100 becomes equity or reserve towards yourself that you can pull out at later times, or for other benefits that the cooperative wants to provide its members. Again, bringing it back to the aspect of cooperatives, or for benefit of the members first, not for benefit of the stakeholders. And so member patronage is really big. You hear a lot about that. And even on the aspect of how and this is where I'm learning a lot, and have a 15-minute video if people are up for that. But this idea of how patronage goes out to members of the cooperative once you do have profit, or what you call profit in the cooperative surplus, and how that gets handled. I did see some rules where patronage to the members can be based on their involvement, their volunteerism, how much time they spend in the cooperative, as well as some of the impacts that they bring to the cooperative. So if you're responsible for 30% sales growth in the cooperative, maybe your patronage at the end of the year, your portion of that surplus is a little bit larger. Those are all tied into how you set up your cooperative and things to think through at the beginning of the cooperative. One kind of high level rule that I saw that a lot of people that I saw are deemed as successful is this idea of 50, 25, 25. So, and again, I'll say one thing, patronage is different than compensation. So I may be a member of the cooperative and, I'm a designer, so I do websites. I'll get paid for my time throughout the course of working that in an annual year. But at the end, if we have a surplus profit, how do we divvy that up amongst workers, amongst shareholders, amongst other impact things, amongst the overall benefit and operational budget of the cooperative itself? And so you'll see some things where if you have profit or surplus at the end of the year, allocating 50% of that back into the cooperative for operational expenses going into the next year is one of the main principles. 25% of the remaining 50% can go towards research and development or any other social or community impact things that you want to do in your local communities or abroad. And then some instances, that last 25% is the nut that goes towards the members of the cooperative. And within that 25%, there's a lot, and I mean a lot of ways that you can divvy that up based on people's involvement or based on the impact that they had over the company overall. Again, I'm at the early phases of understanding how that works and what levers work. But one thing that really stuck out to me in there is how you divvy up surplus and patronage goes a long way into how you survive and how you continue to stay alive as an organization. And so it's really critical to look at what patronage means for the organization prior to like even starting it in some cases. And so I have in parentheses savings. So again, there's been some examples where, hey, if that upfront investment was 10K, then maybe that's coming out of my paycheck as an employee of the cooperative over the course of, every other paycheck or things of that nature. Or there's other things that you can do with that patronage in terms of me having my own dedicated savings plan, which grows with the equity. My percentage of that initial investment or that initial patronage grows with the equity of the organization overall, which raises other questions about when and how you can pull that out. Can you make it transferable to your next of kin in the case of death and things of that nature? But all those things are things to really figure out up front. I feel like I'm talking a lot. Any
You are.
feedback or questions?
You say you had a video on the patronage issue?
Yeah, I did. And I'm
Are
not
we
gonna
gonna
say,
watch it?
yeah, can people see my screen?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say that this is going to make it a little bit clearer or even more clear. But in this example, we talk about it's a long-standing cooperative grocery store, and I'll push play. And this is the CEO or elected executive of that cooperative.
So Seward Co-op is the co-op that I am the general manager for. We're located in Minneapolis. We've had a very dramatic growth narrative. I first started working at the co-op 23 years ago when it was a 1.2 million, 1,200 square foot store. So I can see the vantage point of many sizes. 11 years ago, I came on as the GM, and we were doing about 6 million in sales, had about 70 employees. And by 2008, we were doing 12 million. And the fiscal year that we're in right now, we'll be hitting 34 million in sales. The store itself, in terms of size, is about 13,000 square feet. We're at 240 employees. We have 13,000 owners. And right now we have 2 projects under construction for a total of $15 million of projects under construction. To do that, we had to raise quite a bit of capital. And I'm going to talk a little bit about raising that capital and how that is an important part of our competitive advantage when we have a community of support behind the operations that we have. And one of the key questions I think is how did we so quickly get to redevelopment after building such a large project? So when we did the project several years ago, it was about a $10.5 million project as well. So we went from, a lot of new development in a very short period of time. So it's always important to start with the ends. So at Seward Co-op, we're about sustaining a healthy community with equitable economic relationships, positive environmental impacts, and inclusive socially responsible practices. Not a whole lot about groceries in there, even though we're very much in the industry of groceries. So we built the store down the street on Franklin, had that really incredible, successful launch, and within a couple years, we accomplished what the market study said we'd do in 5 years, and the board started asking, well, at what point is this going to be too small of a store to meet the needs of people coming to the co-op to get their needs met? And I kind of casually looked down the street at the Wedge and said, 30 million. The Wedge is doing 30 million. I think 30 million is the point where we really need to have a project under construction. And our growth continued to be very dynamic. And, we really started to ask questions about, how do we realize these ends? How do we operationalize them and realize the kind of dynamic that we want to have that's articulated in this ends. And so we came up with a long-term vision and a strategy to accomplish that. And at the heart of our long-term vision is this idea around creating commonwealth. That's a word that's, for some people it means a state. You know, why are you talking about creating a state? You know, there's a lot of questions with this word. But if you actually start to dig deeper into the meaning of the word and kind of cycle back to its origin, the origin of the word meant the well-being of others, the well-being of all, the common good. But it also had an economic activity built behind that. You know, and as you start to think about what we're accomplishing as a cooperative, it seemed to me to be the right word. Originally, when we wrote this, we actually had another one, which was called a cooperative zone. You know, I went to Mondragon, learned about the Mondragon cooperative system, and they have a zone of cooperation there that's pretty significant in their economy. And so that was kind of like the touchstone of where that went. But, you know, this word actually captures it better. But there's a few other things that how are we going to accomplish that? You know, what business strategies, as the leader of the co-op, the general manager, what business strategies are we going to take to get there? You know, so one of the things is that, you know, we want to sell sustainably made product, and we actually want to make it. You know, we want to make those products that don't exist necessarily in the marketplace. We want to create what are called sometimes third places, or we call it gathering spaces here, because we think that, you know, if we're going to sustain a healthy community, we have to have a space for people to gather. You know, community over food needs a common space. And then finally, if we were to take our thinking and go out 10, 15, 20 years, you know, what does that look like? And our goal is to try to create more access in the market, to create more opportunities for people to shop at co-ops. And when we got to that point, we actually kind of went back up to the top, which is that we'll actually partner with other people to accomplish these things. And so that's really what we've worked towards, is that we'll work with other co-ops. We'll also then take the efforts necessary to realize some of these projects ourselves. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Commonwealth and what does that actually mean in a real sense. So let's just kind of walk through if we're going to develop, you know, if we're going to be a competitive player in the marketplace, we need to bring to the market more structure. We need to have more options for people to shop. And so let's kind of go through the logic of all that. You know, so, you know, to build greater capacity, we need more assets. We need more structure to do that. So, you know, to either build new assets or to maintain the assets that we have, we need to have money. So where does the money come from? You know, there's three places I tell people. I used to be a lender for the co-ops as well before when I worked at North Country Co-op Development Fund. There are three places that money comes from. One is you borrow it, you earn it, or you steal it. Those are the three places where money actually, if you want to bring money in. Obviously, we're not going to do the last one, and so we have to borrow or earn it. And an earning is really about how do we bring our community into this. That's where I'm kind of going with all this. And so we need to find ways to build owner equity in the business, you know, because we're not going to just borrow our way into the future. We also have to invest in our own future. So I have up here sort of the Seward debt to equity story. So debt to equity is how you, banks or other boards, you look at this as how.
Sorry, disclaimer here, it's going to get a little bit more boring before it gets interesting. So
we got what we own. So you have assets, and you either borrowed money or you earned or built it amongst yourselves, amongst the co-op. And so for every dollar of debt, there's how many dollars of equity. And so you look at the history, though, over time. 2004, 2009 is when we moved down the street. 2014 is the end of last fiscal year, and then December 14 of 2014 is after we financed all these, you know, $15 million of projects under construction. And what's really different you see here is, you know, after we built, you know, before we led up into the relocation, our debt to equity number was not that great. You know, a good debt to equity number is between 2 and 3.5 to 1. You know, when you get to 2 to 1 debt to equity, you're maybe not leveraged as well as you could be if you're thinking from a lender's perspective. When you get to 3.5, there start to be questions about, are you over leveraged? And so if you look at these numbers, you'll see that we borrowed 11 million. That shot our debt to equity ratio almost to 7-to-1, meaning $7 of debt for every dollar of equity. And from a banker's perspective, that's kind of risky. But then you look at December of 2014, after we raised 15 million. By the way, 3.1 million of that came from owners investing in the co-op. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But you look at this and you see that after all this, we did 3-to-1. We're still actually in a position where we could probably borrow more money based on what bankers perceive as being reasonable debt to equity. One thing that's also a really important adjustment that we all need to make at co-ops is, there's two vehicles often for co-ops to obtain owner investment. One is direct investment, C stock in terms for Minnesota. I'll explain those in a minute. And owner loans or member loans, and that's the historic way that we've financed our co-ops over the years. And so sometimes you can make an adjustment that the owner loans is pseudo equity, and so that's what the second set of tiered numbers are. And so let's just kind of break down. So this is another slide. This is the last slide for my presentation. There's a number of different forms of equity on our balance sheet. So when I started at Sewer, we had equity of $447,000 total on our books. But if you look at this, there's a number of different types. A stock in Minnesota is the ownership stock. When someone joins the co-op, they buy voting shares. That's for us $75. And you can see it's a pretty steady, even number across the history of the co-op. But the one that I really want to talk about is the patronage refund B stock. So, if you think about, running a good operation, which is core, this is an assumption. Over the history of the Seward Co-op, we've had 3.5% to 4% pre-distribution net income, which is what creates the patronage refund. And as we go from 6 million to now 34 million, that 3 to 4% actually becomes quite a bit more money. In the last few years, it's been more around like $800,000 is what our patronage refunds have been running. And so then the question is how much of that's distributed in cash. The board has to make that decision. And how much is distributed in equity, in B stock, allocated value to the owner. And part of what I'm wanting to talk about here is really the importance of that B stock piece. And it's been the biggest growth of equity for Seward Co-op. And we've actually, since I started at the co-op 20 plus years ago, we've always had this view that B stock should stay in the co-op. It should never be repurchased, never be redeemed. And the reason why is there's always a need for capital for the co-op. But the real question becomes if we're really wanting to grow the market more effectively, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to build the capital basis to leverage to the future? And this is actually a really important vehicle. And there's actually some really rational and logical reasons why this should be part of our consideration about how we capitalize the future. And the reason why is that if you think about how the patronage refund is distributed, it's distributed proportional to use. Whoever uses the co-op more gets a bigger share of the profit. If you think about the wear and tear on the business and who proportionally had more wear and tear on the business, it would be people who use the store the most. So the patronage refund vehicle is actually a very good way to match the use of the co-op's assets with the investment requirement of the co-op. Obviously, when you go to look at building greater capacity, there's maybe some counter logic that could be, that could undermine that a little bit. But I actually think there's some real value because what happens is the co-op grows and has more and more people demanding use of its space, is there is a need to move and have additional spaces for them. So the question becomes, with B stock is, isn't that the owner's money? And the answer is yes, absolutely. But it's also the owner's co-op. So shouldn't the owners of the co-op reinvest? And so my point is, because I've heard this in the past through peers and conversations, that this is just money on loan temporarily and we have to repurchase it sometime down the road. I think there's a good argument for that this should actually never be repurchased unless the co-op ceases to exist. Because for as long as the co-op is going to exist, there's going to be a need for capital. There's going to need to be reinvestment in the co-op, and it has a very strong basis to have that reinvestment proportional to use. And at the end of the day, it is a board decision. And one of the reasons why I really felt like this is a great opportunity to talk about this particular topic is that board members should really think about what is their role in governance. It's to represent the interests of the owners of the co-op, right? And to safeguard and provide a strong fiduciary basis for the co-op to exist for the next generation, to leave something for the future and not just live in the now. And so that's my conversation about equity and how to build equity. Obviously, you need to grow your operations to build the equity through patronage refund, and you need to have solid operations and share the profits proportionally to use. But if you do that, there's actually a very good avenue for building a stronger balance sheet.
So I'll stop there. What the hell? Sorry. I'll stop there and open the floor for any questions. But hey, Liz, that's just one of the ways that, and the reason that stood out to me is because it's almost in your organization or in the co-op, there's a group understanding that keeping money in the co-op and not necessarily extracting all of the reserve or the what's it called, profit, for lack of a better word, but that you be intentional about it staying in the organization to essentially create your own fund of stability, which raise other questions. How is that different from retained earnings and things of that nature? But that was one of the videos that kind of communicated to me the power of patronage from the members in the cooperative and ultimately in sustainability. And then lastly, you'll see this in cooperative federations where there may be an overarching fund or federation that all other co-ops under it invest into a fund for that cooperative in case one of those co-ops are struggling or having a bad financial year, which reinforces this idea of creating sustainable communities for co-ops. And so I don't know if that helped provide any clarity on patronage. Does it raise more questions or ideas from people as we look at work cooperatives and things of that nature?
So can I just clarify real quick what he was proposing do for Minneapolis? So with the patronage B stocks, I'm not super familiar with how equity works to begin with, but from my understanding, they're saying that like the people who are using the grocery store the most, like they put the most dollars into it, then or they just like use the facility the most, they are then say like at the end of the year like making the most or receiving the most money, or they're simply like getting more money to then reinvest into the organization. Because that part I do get, you want to have some type of nest egg. You don't want to take out all the money that you possibly can, because then there's a lot more room for something to go wrong. So yeah, I guess like where are they putting the money? Are they saying they're giving more money back to the people that are using it, or they're putting more money back into the reinvestment?
So that raised a point for me too, because up until the video, I hadn't heard of patronage for utilizing the cooperative. I heard mostly patronage tied to how much you work in the cooperative or how much time you invest in the cooperative. And so I think there's a distinction in the cooperative. When you talk about members, there can be members that work in the cooperative and there can be members that just support the cooperative from buying. And so I think it offers an incentive for raising monies for membership. I think you mentioned like 1,300 members. I know that those aren't all people working in the cooperative. So that it kind of double reinforces, you know, and pay your $75 to us. It makes you a member. And then you also get additional benefits at the end of the year for leveraging and using the actual business and its resources as much as possible. And I believe that can go alongside the benefit of patronage for the internal workers in the cooperative as well. Now that's where I get confused, because I'm like, if I do my work as an employee and then I get my W-2, are we talking about sweat equity work that I do outside of my job description towards that patronage? Or is it can also be other things like, hey, I brought in the sale, or I brought in so many additional members that are tied to that patronage. And I think that is something that you have to be strategic about in the beginning when you're looking at how you want to build a pipeline for sustainability.
I imagine at that point, wouldn't you just have both possibilities where, like even the members who, because this is new to me, I guess, like, so you're going to have the members who are also working there, and then the members who might not be working there. But I mean, you would, in a perfect world, right, you would want both to be using the products or whatever kind of services that you guys are actually offering. So wouldn't the people who are working there get the best of both worlds, where like, okay, cool,
Yeah.
you worked here, here's your cut because you worked here, and then also, hey, you use the services with that money that you got from working here, so now you get like an extra bonus? Is that
Well, I'm wondering if just because you work there, you get an extra bonus. Because to me, when they talk about members, as a member, that was the Class A, that anybody that I guess either purchases Class A stock, whether they work there or not, have that stock. But to me, if they work there, they're getting paid to work there. So that's their benefit. And then the patronage, which it sounded like the way he defined it was anybody who's actually purchasing from the co-op. So to me, I don't understand. I don't think that people who work there should get a double benefit when they're getting paid to do their work. But they're members also, so they also have their membership share. But to me, it seemed like the patronage is, even if you're a member, like Damon said earlier, you can get additional benefit from how much of your money you spend with the co-op.
Yeah. And I don't know if any, but yeah. And so that to me is something that's loosely kind of forming in my mind, is that I think it comes back to the principles of the organization and where you can be more intentional about how you reward patronage. And so I could see situations where, if the emphasis is in building, education in the community, you could put in your bylaws and your governance and your structure that, hey, even though, because he had mentioned it too, a lot of the things that they had in their vision and their principles was not necessarily tied to the grocery store. So I could see situations where, yeah, I get paid as an employee, but because this co-op is more focused on bringing better quality education, if I also do some volunteer time towards education through assets or through whatever programming of that cooperative, and because I am a member, that could be considered patronage if that is what the co-op decides. And so I really feel like there's a lot of flexibility in how you treat profits and reserves for co-ops that's tied to principles and purpose and the vision, versus the traditional model of, if there's profit, let me take it off the table because that's my share. And I think in that aspect, and that's why I feel like it's really critical to have principles and practices, vision and strategy at the beginning of the co-op to think about long-term sustainability versus getting in the work and then trying to figure it out. And I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how I'm thinking about it or looking at it. And again, we have one more conversation among these things, but I really feel like that idea of patronage is critical to the sustainability of any cooperative and how you treat that. Because like you said, you can either borrow the money at high debt, and he showed some of his debt to dollar ratios that were crazy, or you can earn it, or you can steal it. And but you can also retain it, right? and that's critical to the growth and sustainability of not just the cooperative, but even like cooperative ecosystems from what I've seen.
Dave, I am
Mhm.
curious though, you have under patronage 501c3 partnerships and grants. So a for-profit, how would they be able to benefit from a 501c3 grant?
So you think of CDFIs that give out grants to BIPOC entrepreneurs because it's tied to a social economic thing that they've been paid for. And so in our example, I'll use like African American quality of life. As a 501c3, we're supporting entrepreneurs who have for-profit companies, but because they're in underrepresented neighborhoods or things of that nature, it's free money, or quote unquote free money, to them for raising for raising it as a for-profit or as a cooperative. So that's how I see, that's how that works, I guess, if that makes sense. And so leveraging your nonprofit relationships, which a lot of people do with Kepra, for sustainability is another way as well. And then the last one on there is bartering, which is, of course, at a high level cooperation amongst cooperatives. So trade of services between cooperatives in the federation or in the community, and even trade of services between members within that. And then I did see some early examples of where bartering can also be tied to, like the time bank, time tools and materials in patronage as well too, based on whether some of the things that you're trying to emphasize in your cooperative. For example, skills development. If there's somebody in the co-op that can train people, that may be above and outside of their employee job or whatever. Those can be things that can be considered involvement in patronage when you come at the end of the year and you figure out how to divvy up that 3 or 4% of reserves that are left in the company. And so again, these are all, for me, and hope for others, all ways that once it's up and running, and even when you are at a point of stability, but you want to look at growth and how do you serve and how do you expand your mission of the cooperative. These are some of those ways that aren't just about, trading a dollar for a service. Got about 10 minutes left. And so I'll open the floor for questions, conversations, things of that nature.
No, I just wanted to add on the 501c3 partnership and grants, that also one of the ways that Kepra serves entrepreneurs, and it doesn't necessarily have to be money. It could be technical assistance that the organization pays for the business. So it keeps it from coming out of their pocket, but that's also a resource that businesses can take advantage of too.
For sure.
Or co-ops, I should say, I guess, any business or co-ops.
All right. There aren't any other points, thoughts, topics?
I did have a question. I guess maybe for some of the elders, as y'all were starting the organization, or like when y'all started the organization, was it considered a 501c3 in the traditional sense? Like, I'm not sure what the history of like the nonprofit label is exactly, but was that how y'all started? Was there ever any conversation around like beginning this as like under a cooperative model, like kind of what we're putting out here, or was that, I'm sure those kinds of ideas.
I'll just share, and then M and Paulette can say if they see differently. So, again, I know the whole story about, wanting to provide a safe place for African-American males, wanting to learn social entrepreneurship, public speaking, And so at the time, I was working at the Indianapolis Urban League, and I managed their workforce development department, and I learned how to write grants. But in order to get grants, you had to be a 501c3. So we had a conversation about, hey, there's money out there to be had that we could get along with our social enterprises for this entity. So how about we form a 501c3? And we said, yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so it was born out of the like, hey, we want grants to be able to fund this stuff.
But we had a substantial social enterprise, and Paulette and them could talk more about that. We had the Good Stuff thrift store, and it was bringing in buku dollars. But again, you want to always look at diversifying your revenue streams, and grants was a way to do it, and donations, because 501c3 can get both.
Right. I do remember a kind of an early thing back then that M used to tout, tax free is the way for me. So it had some play in it as well too. Oh, we can make this money, we ain't gotta pay no taxes on it. Cool. Let's go nonprofit.
Yeah, it really was a revenue stream that we looked at, because we had the one, which was the thrift store, but you can't live forever on one revenue stream.
Mhm.
And so that was, and then Pambana was there who had worked at a 501c3, and we just had the great good fortune. How'd you find that lady that only charged us
I don't know
$500?
how we found that attorney. I really don't know. That was the universe. I can't remember. But I think, you were doing that Black Books directory, Paulette, and I think she was in there. I think that's how I found her.
But so the universe just kind of, there was a little hint here. We came up with the idea, and then there was a lawyer that materialized. We were looking, but just and so a lot of times, I think Pambana, how does M say it, guys? When you go forward and do good or something, the universe will stretch out to meet you, or something like that. So that's how we decided on the 501c3.
And then
And
I
it was
will
only-
share with y'all a jewel too, that the lawyer that helped us do that, her name was, I think, Octavia, I want to say Sewell or something like that. So, after we created the OVC, I was like, interesting. What do you want to call it? Completion of the circle or something.
But it was an idea to look at, and so it's not like we felt it would hold us back or that we would get rich off of it. It was something that it was like a business. It was like a social enterprise, and we decided to give it a try. And in giving it a try, and we didn't do well in the beginning with getting grants. I know we tried a variety of things. Pambana went and found this way that you have you organize it and have tables, and you have table captains, and those table captains get 10 people, and it didn't produce it. It didn't come to fruit. And then we tried some other pieces, and they did, and it was only small fruit. And so we always had the idea, though, of the social enterprise. It was never the reliance on being able to write grants. But so we always did the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. We never were grant dependent. It was always our social enterprises was the bread and butter. And then there was, of course, donations from people who thought we were really putting in the effort to work with our young people, like Donna and Musa. They never not brought us $100 check for some reason, for donation of some kind, every month, way back up in the beginning. So we had those three.
I think that's an interesting point too, because and that kind of raises a question for me that I can see some parallels between cooperatives and being intentional about the purpose and the principles of the cooperative in fundraising before jumping into the cooperative. Because and the question that I have is, you play with the for-profit of the thrift store, which I remember those days. I really appreciate those days actually in the dark basement. But the idea, and then at some point it became about resources are a lot more infinite when it's relational, social capital based from. And so when did, because what I'm understanding, it was, let's try to for-profit thrift store. Okay, well, let's diversify and go nonprofit. But then there was this one thing where I feel like it was kind of a lot more exponential, at least in theory or in the way it felt, of not investing. So not necessarily about the outcome of what, not necessarily about what we're producing, but how we produce it, that led to a lot more equity, a lot more resources, to where like raising money wasn't necessarily always the first goal to go out and get. It was more about
Well, I
developing those
think,
relationships. Yeah.
Damon, I don't think that raising money was ever our first goal. I mean, even
Yeah,
when
right.
we built the thrift store, it was
Right.
built on our relationships with people in community. So,
Right.
I mean, as a nonprofit, we were just getting started and we didn't have those relationships, let's say, with foundations and things like that. So it took time to build those relationships, but the relationships that we had, we used.
Right. And so that raised another question too, because there was this idea about, whenever you put structure around something, it's just really reformation. It's not really creating nothing new. And so is cooperative just, because I think Alvin talked about it last week, like you can use a cooperative and be just as corrupt as a for-profit company through a cooperative lens. And so I almost feel like it still comes back to those initial principles that inform how you go about raising capital, how you go about building infrastructure and principles to stay sustainable and things of that nature. That is a little bit more freeing, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I think it's the name of our co-op conference that we did. It was an insistence that it be called cooperation. Yeah, I've forgotten exactly what the name was when we did it out at P30. It was the cooperatives, even though it was a co-op conference, it was not called cooperatives. It was called cooperation, a conference about a cooperation. Do you remember exactly what we call it? But there was an
I know what you're talking about.
Pardon?
I don't, but I know what you're talking about.
Right. Because I kept saying, well, why don't we call it cooperatives in action or blah, blah, blah. It was no. The word has got to be cooperation, because we've got to be in cooperation before we start planning, putting a structure around a cooperatives, because it's got to be about cooperation from the participants.
I was also just gonna say that, like, I think that, even just like from the beginning of like learning about like cooperatives, like especially like in this conversation, I've always like kind of interpreted it as like being about two things at the same time. Like part of the conversation, I think, is always about like the idea of a cooperative as like a legal framework that, of course, like allows you to access some things and prohibits you from accessing others. But then I think it's also about like what Mrs. Fair is talking about, and like the idea that there's like a spirit of cooperation, which is why I think that, like, even though Kepler is officially legally on paper a 501c3 nonprofit, I still think that in a lot of ways we do embody, a cooperative economy. On some level, so I think that, like, So yeah, you know, I think that it's definitely more, it's about more than the it's about more than like the official structure, you know. I think it also just is about like, it has to do with like the nature of the relationships between the different parts of like the organization or the community.
Yeah, it
Um,
really
oh,
it's just continuing some of that conversation from earlier today's staff meeting, you know, not trying to get too wrapped up in like the particular structures that go into it and being able to rely on relationship as the guiding principle and you know what carries you through figuring out all the little nuances of how it's going to work and you know where we're going to get this revenue from and how we're going to you know whatever in the weeds.
that concludes my presentation so far of what we've had. I know we're at 4:32. Are there any other questions, points, feedback, or even things that you want to see discussed in the next conversation, which essentially is, and I feel like we started that conversation with how cooperative grows strategically over time. I'm going to use the Mondragon example because they've grown exponentially over the last 50 years. So just want to put that out there for next month's mumbo jumbo on cooperative communities.
Yeah,
Other than that, I pass it back to the facilitator.
um,
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say I would like to also see you know where you see maybe even the cooperative model going over the next couple of years. Like, do you see any particular like trends in how they're operating now based off of like how they're operating before and stuff like that?
That's a great point. I mean, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there was one notion that I've been seeing. I haven't found a great example of it before, but this idea of tokenization. So it kind of equalizes work and effort outside of fiduciary, just what the money represents. And that, you know, using blockchain and DAOs and ways of keeping track of that and things of that nature. And then there's another trend of union cooperatives. So yeah, those are all good points. So I'll do some research on that as well. Thank you, Jerry.
Well, yeah, thank you, Damon, for that presentation and for, you know, walking us through that knowledge. Thank you to everybody for coming today, especially Miss Victoria, who's new to the space. Great to see you, great to hear from you. Thank you to the Indianapolis Recorder for allowing us to stream to their Facebook page. And yeah, see y'all next week.
Yep.
Bye,
Catch you.
bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.